bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Part of NASA have come up with this idea of faking the Apollo missions because they couldn't actually achieve it. They didn't have the necessary equipment to do it safely, because the one thing they wanted to avoid was killing an astronaut live on television, because it was all going to be shown live on television. Remember that? That was one of the great features. We could all watch it happening live on television.
Marcus, I want to ask you this, because this just came to mind, and it seems more pertinent now than ever. When you're talking about outgassing of materials, and that would apply, I'm assuming, to any material, you would presumably have outgassing of materials in space, in the vacuum of space. We know that the lunar module was a very fragile craft, so much so that it couldn't withstand its own weight here on Earth.
That's right, yeah.
And there are areas, especially around the astronaut compartment of the lunar module, that had walls equivalent to the thickness of 3 layers of kitchen foil.
Yes.
So, yeah,
amazing.
and that's a fact. Anybody can look that up. That's a fact. My question would be, besides an astronaut accidentally putting his foot through the wall, and then instant annihilation for both of the astronauts and the lunar module, if that were to happen, my question to you is, if outgassing, and outgassing is obviously a problem. So common sense would tell you the thicker the metals, the longer you would have in terms of outgassing before it become a problem. Yeah. How would outgassing, in terms of effect over time, affect walls equivalent to 3 layers of kitchen foil? I mean, the outgassing would have a faster effect on those walls that were covering that were used to contain the astronauts in an environment to keep them alive, right? So how would the outgassing on those lunar module walls with a thickness of 3 layers of kitchen foil? I don't think anybody can answer that question on the surface of the moon. They were on the moon for hours. Because
they weren't tested under those conditions, and this is the problem. Now, it's an interesting follow-up on that to an extent. 2 or 3 years ago, the Israeli Space Agency launched their Bereshit, which means Genesis, Bereshit spacecraft, unmanned, to the moon. It was a big achievement. It was financed privately in Israel, and they were very proud of having got the thing off the ground, and it was within a few miles of the lunar surface, and they were just bringing the craft down to land on the lunar surface when they lost all contact with it, because basically the craft had crashed.
Yeah.
Now, I happen to know at the time that some of the engine mountings, the rocket engine mounting on the descending craft, had been 3D printed, which is a logical thing to do. But if they hadn't tested the 3D printed material in the conditions that they were going to meet on the lunar surface, those materials may well have failed. Now, I was interviewed on Israeli television about this at the time the Bereshit mission was on its way, and they just heard that it had crashed. And I just mentioned, almost offhand, to the producer, I said, have they tested the 3D printed engine mounting material at a level of vacuum that they were going to meet on the lunar surface? He said, I don't know, but I'll pass it on. I presume it was passed on. I haven't heard anything since, but Israel haven't tried to do any subsequent landings. Now, if that was a lesson, that any material being used on the moon has to be tested at the level of vacuum that we know exists on the moon, if it hasn't been tested, either the stories that are being put out as to the result of those tests are fake, or they have material which can survive. Now, we know that spacecraft have reached the moon. I mentioned the Ranger craft, the Surveyor craft, the orbiter, lunar orbiter craft. Those were all unmanned. They were sent to take photographs, which they did quite successfully. And just before anybody says, well, how were they taking photographs back then? If you say that photographic film doesn't work in a vacuum. No, it doesn't work in a vacuum. They were taking photographs. The point is, the one mission that used photographic film was the Lunar Orbiter, not to be confused with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. That came in 2009.
Yes.
Lunar Orbiter was 1966. Its purpose was to photograph the lunar surface to identify potential landing sites for Apollo. This is when they were still intending to land. And it used photographic film in the spacecraft. And it was developed on board the spacecraft using a Polaroid type system where film can be developed using chemicals that are the film goes through. It's a standard procedure. Edwin Land, who's the developer of the Polaroid cameras and Polaroid system, was one of the advisors to the Lunar Orbiter. But the point of that is that all the camera equipment on the Lunar Orbiter was contained within a pressurized container on the spacecraft.
This was back in the 1960s.
Back in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Which is more or less equivalent time or same sort of time as the hexagon spy satellite was being developed. So there would be
65, 66.
65, 66. Hexagon spy satellite was first launched in 1970. Sort of part of during the Apollo program. So obviously this is all going on at the same time. So if the Lunar Orbiter was developing its film and it was using photographic film, this stuff, on board the spacecraft using Polaroid, that's quite legitimate. That's a sensible thing to do. The resulting picture was then scanned on board the spacecraft, transmitted back to Earth, reassembled, and they could then look at the picture. But the point is, it was within a pressurized environment.
That's what I was going to ask you to clarify. That was so the film, the camera had its own environment within the spacecraft.
Yes, it did. And if you look at the schematics of the Lunar Orbiter and of the Hexagon, you'll see it says pressurized container. So they knew about it. They knew they had to pressurize the film.
Not very something much. I want to ask you.
About 1 pound per square inch. That's all it needs. Doesn't make much. Yeah.
So no, say that again.
It was pressurized about 1 pound per square inch.
Yes.
Not very much. They were using nitrogen gas bottles, and the pressure was maintained within the spacecraft. And it could also maintain a degree of temperature, because temperature in space is quite a severe problem, as we may come on to discuss. But pressure and humidity can be kept within acceptable limits for photographic film, which it was on the Lunar Orbiter. So
that was enough to maintain quality photos?
Yes, it could maintain it. 1 pound per square inch. Not very much, not very much, quite a low level, but enough to maintain the integrity of the photographic film. This stuff.
Now, if they were to use that, if they had to use that technique in the Apollo missions, that would have, I mean, I'm putting this out there. This is really not my expertise, but I'm asking you, if they were to use that same pressurization system for their cameras on the moon, the lunar surface, they would obviously have a bulkier camera or to carry.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, quite right. Yeah.
And be a lot more involved in pressurizing and maintaining that pressurization of the film while they were supposedly walking on a lunar surface.
Correct. Yeah. And it would be very obvious if the camera, the Hasselblad camera, had been pressurized. It'd be very obvious because it would be surrounded by, not a very big case, but it would be surrounded by something you could identify. None of the Hasselblad cameras used allegedly on the lunar surface were pressurized, nor were the Maurer film cameras mounted inside the lunar lander. And on Apollo 11, there's photographed the two astronauts prancing around, putting the flag up, talking to the president. And that wasn't pressurized either, because there are pictures of it. Now, if you're going to pressurize anything, it's got to be contained within an airtight container. And it wasn't. I've handled a replica lunar camera. Hasselblad UK have one they'll lend you if you ask them very nicely. And it's accompanied by its own security guard, so you can't run off with it. But it's exactly the same in appearance. The replica that I've handled here on Earth on a TV program is exactly the same as you see in the photographs taken allegedly on the lunar surface.
Which proves the point that it was not pressurized.
Wasn't pressurized, no.
Now, I want to ask you this because this has been on my mind ever since you brought it up several minutes ago, and I wrote it down. You mentioned when you were talking to the Israeli, when you were interviewed by Israeli television, that I don't know if you brought this up during the interview or if you contacted them afterwards, but you brought up a very good point about the materials outgassing on any, whether it be an unmanned mission or a manned mission, and that you made the very interesting comment that, well, if they were using materials that did not outgas, or they found a way around that, that could not be released, because if that information was released, then all you have to do right there, that just kills the Apollo narrative. I mean, that's it. It's gone. It's over, and it's gone anyway, as far as I'm concerned. But that would be akin to the work that you, Scott, and Robert have done with the film working or not working in the vacuum of space. And that's a very interesting point. If their spacecraft failed on the way to the lunar surface, and it was because of the components, the 3D components that they were using were outgassing, and that could have caused the failure. If they have rectified that, then that also brings into question not only, and this is going to be a very loaded statement, but I want your opinion on this. Would that not bring into question not only the manned missions, but some of the unmanned missions?
Oh, certainly it would. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the unmanned missions that have gone to Mars.
Yeah.
Went to Mars. 50% of those missions failed.
Yeah.
Some of them crashed. Some of them, they got the measurements wrong. They were transmitting in meters, and the craft was accepting it in imperial, so it didn't know what the hell it was talking about. Some of them crashed, and it could well be the same problem, that some of the components, not all of them necessarily, but some of the components would outgas, and if they were structural components and the structure failed, the craft would fail. And that's what appears to have happened on the Bereshit Israeli craft. It was the engine mountings which held the engine. Now, if one of those failed, the engine would then not be obeying its commands. It wouldn't be doing what it was supposed to do, and the thing would crash, which is what happened. Now, obviously, the Chinese are fully aware of it because they've landed craft on the moon, and they've also orbited craft around the moon, so they're fully aware. The Soviets have done the same. The Indians, or the Japanese space agency, JAXA, have photographed the lunar surface, and it's been used to show, well, exactly the same as the Apollo photographs. So some of the Apollo photographs must be exactly what we're told the lunar surface looks like. Well, yes, don't forget that Apollo had the lunar orbiter photographs, so they could create a lunar surface correctly from the photographs, which they did. And Scott and Robert have done a very interesting film recently showing the incredible divergence between the reported dimensions of the Hadley Rill, that's Apollo 15, the Hadley Rill, which is this sort of trench thing that's near the landing spot, we're told. And it's been measured. It was 900 meters deep and 1.5 kilometers across. They compared that to Meteor Crater in Arizona, which is 400 meters deep and about 1 kilometer in diameter, or thereabouts, i.e. smaller than the Hadley Rill. You put the two photographs together, the Hadley Rill and the Meteor Crater in Arizona, you put the two photographs, they look completely different. And yet the Hadley Rill is supposed to be bigger than the Meteor Crater. So they got that wrong. Yeah.
And it's interesting too, when you brought up the previous manned missions from China, India, Japan, they conveniently don't show any remnants of the Apollo lunar landings on the lunar surface.
Funny that, isn't it?
Isn't it? Isn't it?
They weren't flying in the same orbit. They weren't attempting to do it. No. They would have done it if they could.
Or you're not allowed to fly over those sites, which NASA was trying to impose. I mean, there's just any excuse in the book That it was just like the future manned, supposed manned mission coming up is now being pushed back by years, and no surprise there.
Surprise. Yeah.
And yeah, no, it was interesting when you brought that up because proponents have tried to use that against me. And when I come back and they actually post the link and I'm asking, well, where's the remnants? Where's the evidence of the Apollo landing? Well, it's the same photo. Okay, it's the same photo, but there's nothing that in that photo that NASA claims. For example, they'll show, let's say, Apollo 11. Just taking that as an example.
Yeah.
So they'll show the area where Apollo 11 landed, but they don't show any remnants left from the Apollo 11 landing. And this is the argument that proponents would use. Well, they used, I forget the name of the spacecraft the Chinese used, but they use those photos all the time to try to prove their point. So they'll show the photo of the area where Apollo 11 landed, but it doesn't show Apollo 11.
No, it doesn't, because it's not there.
Yeah. And when you point that out, well, you're not seeing it. Well,
where is it?
Where is it?
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah. So it's very interesting that all these countries that claim, and I am going to use the word claim,
yeah,
to have gone to the lunar surface in terms of their unmanned missions, fail to show the one significant thing that people would pay to see,
yeah,
and that is photos of the Apollo lunar landings.
Yeah.
And none of them show it.
One agency has shown them, and that's NASA.
Yeah.
They used the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. I mentioned the Lunar Orbiter. These are completely different spacecraft.
Yes.
The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2009 was using camera equipment, we're told, that was equivalent to some of the camera equipment used on Earth orbiting satellites. And if you look at some of these Earth orbiting satellites operated by independent companies, they're using camera equipment which can identify an object of 0.4 meters across, quite small. They can identify the same thing on Earth. And these Earth orbiting satellites, GOI-1 is the main commercial satellite.
Yep.
GOI-1, photographing from 600 kilometers above the Earth's surface through all the dust and pollution and diffusion that the atmosphere would create. And you can see your own car parked outside your house.
Yeah.
You can see details on that car.
Yep.
If your car's got a sunroof, which is about 3 foot across, you can see that as a separate item on the car. You may not be able to read the number plate on the car, which is always the claim made. Oh, the satellites are so good they can read a newspaper headline from space. Yeah, if the headline's that big, you probably could. But the photographs taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which orbited 60 miles above the lunar surface and was then deliberately brought down to 15 miles above the lunar surface to photograph the Apollo landing sites, don't show anything except a few pixels, a black pixel and a white pixel.
And no atmosphere.
No atmosphere. It's through the vacuum of space.
Yep.
And it shows absolutely nothing.
And there should be a lot of clarity, given that there's no atmosphere.
I've heard of Photoshop.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Basically, that's what it's done. And people have done the research to demonstrate that Photoshop was used on those photographs. It's more NASA desperately trying to bolster its own story by using the same techniques that they used in the first place. Fakery.
And the other thing is too, and I did put some of those photo comparisons in my book. And when you were talking about the lunar orbiter in the mid-1960s that was used to map out potential landing sites and do a generalized mapping of the lunar surface, you look at those photos, and we're talking, 55 plus years ago, there's a lot of clarity in those photos. I mean, they're comparable to some of the photos I've seen with satellites today. And not only that, but they got down really a low altitude. I mean, you're almost looking at, you're not, but it's almost eye level. You were standing on the lunar surface, the clarity of the photos that they had gotten with the lunar orbiter in the mid-1960s pre-Apollo missions, I call them.
Yeah.
You compare those photos to the photos, and I'm only speaking specifically of the photos from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2009. I'm not talking about the photos that are taken of the entire mapping of the lunar surface. Those photos are excellent.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they're digitized and enhanced and whatnot, but they're really good. But you compare just the photos that that orbiter in 2009 had taken, supposedly had taken of the lunar landing sites, and those photos don't even come anywhere near close to the clarity and definition of the photos taken 55 years ago.
They don't.
Yeah. And you don't have to be a photographic expert to see this one, which is really what I've gotten into it with a couple of people. I don't really talk to them much anymore about it, but you don't have to be, oh, you're a photographic expert, Randy. No, I'm not, but I have eyes. I have common sense.
That's it.
And that's something that they should start using themselves, because you can see it as clear as day, night and day. You could see the contrast between the photos taken from the lunar orbiter in the mid-1960s compared to the one taken in 2009, specifically of the Apollo lunar landing site, the alleged Apollo lunar landing sites. And those photos don't even come close to the clarity of photos taken 55 years ago.
No, they don't. No, it's almost as if they're trying to hide the fact.
Yeah.
They could do it 55 years ago, but they can't do it today. It's like, but technology does not go backwards. Technology never goes backwards. Cameras get better, spacecraft get better. It doesn't go backwards, but that's what it appears, what appears to be the same, because NASA are now caught on the horns of a dilemma, and their dilemma is that they claim to have landed humans on the lunar surface back in the 1960s, late 1960s, but they can't do it now in 2022. They claim to be trying to, but they've now taken, it was first ordered by President Trump in December 2019, NASA will return to the lunar surface, not to plant flags and leave footprints, but to conduct scientific experiments. There's a legitimate statement for a president to make.
Yeah.
We're now in 2022. They haven't even got the rocket off the ground yet, let alone gone into orbit, certainly not into lunar orbit. And yet we're expected to believe that this is going to happen. NASA themselves have now said that they're unlikely to be able to achieve it before 2028, which is longer between 2019 and 2028 than it took Apollo to go from a standing start with no equipment and nothing to landing allegedly on the lunar surface.
And the counter argument to that, just sorry to interrupt you, but the counter argument to that is that NASA had a space agency before NASA itself. I think it was NACI, if I'm not mistaken, and that they used that decades of research from that. So they'll say, well, it wasn't a standing start from 1962 onwards, but in essence, it was a standing start because the space agency before NASA was signed into existence by President Dwight Eisenhower was really, their contribution was to the aviation world, very little contribution to the outer space world, if I could put it that way. So basically, NASA had really little to work with when they were planning the manned mission. So it was a standing start from 1962 to 1969.
Yeah, a standing start to put humans into space.
Yes,
they weren't
let alone,
space until Alan Shepard went up in April
61.
April 61. That was around the time that Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth, right round the Earth. America couldn't get into orbit. It was John Glenn a year later that went into orbit, first American into orbit. So to say that there was all this work being done is complete nonsense. It's yet another ridiculous statement by the NASA proponents trying desperately to maintain the fiction that NASA landed men on the moon, because they have to keep coming back to this. They have to keep saying, oh, they were doing it for many years beforehand. They weren't doing it. They were trying to launch hydrogen bombs onto Russia. That was the main purpose of the big rockets. But because the Soviet Union weren't very good at making small nuclear bombs. They had to get big rockets to launch them, which is why they were so good at rocket technology. I mean,
and most, if any, of those ICBMs wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, of course
they wouldn't have worked.
And just as an aside, even if they did work, you didn't know where they were going to land.
Yeah.
You couldn't predict the timing and the location that the bomb was going to land on, so it wouldn't go off.
It wouldn't go off, exactly.
You had to,
and it wouldn't even survive re-entry.
No, exactly. There was no protection against re-entry.
Yeah. Well, even if there was, I mean, they could write that into the books and there was protection, but they had no, from the little bit that I have looked into, there was no real stabilizing force to mechanism to keep that re-entry vehicle, a warhead re-entry vehicle, stable. There's one point I want to bring up. I'm going back a bit. I write things down because you have so many interesting things to say. But when we were talking about the photos in the mid-1960s compared to the photos in 2009 of the specifically of the lunar landing sites, I've often wondered why they didn't just fake that and have a camera there to show the lunar lander, the descender that's sitting on the lunar surface and all the moon buggy sitting there. And I realize now the reason why they haven't faked that, because they could easily fake that with technology that they have today, is because they would have to factor in the wear and tear from the environment, the harsh environment that those remnants, lunar landing remnants would be in. So for example, how would solar flares, coronal mass ejections, how would micrometeoroids, radiation, debris from space affect the flag that's on the lunar surface but was planted there by the astronauts? How would that affect the materials on the lunar lander portion? Now you have the ascent of the lunar lander, lunar module, and then the descent portion. How would it affect that? The moon buggy, how would it affect that? They would have to show wear and tear, and it would have to be very convincing. So that's why they just sort of did a very crude photos showing in 2009 lunar landers, because I mean you could tell it's photoshopped. I mean, you don't have to be an expert to see that. But I just wanted to bring that point out, is that's right. They just pretty well figure. It's like the no stars in the sky concept as well. We couldn't fake it. It would be an amateur photographer would be able to determine if they were actually on a lunar surface by looking at the photo. So, hey, we'll just make it black. So I think that's kind of the direction they went in when it comes to the remnants supposedly left on a lunar surface from the Apollo missions. So they can't fake it because they would have to factor in the wear and tear. So I just wanted to get that point out because it was very interesting. I thought of that when you were talking earlier.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, because that can be confirmed actually by something which happened on the Soviet Mir space station. It was the first Soviet space station, and because they were very proud of it and proud of having got up there, they put a Soviet flag outside the space station. So, we're here, the Soviets, we've done it. Ordinary flag made of cloth. And so when the Mir space station was deorbited, because it was not working very well, they said, well, we better get the flag back, because we should bring that back with us. We come back to Kazakhstan, to the Baikonur space station. So they went outside, did a little spacewalk to have a look for the flag. They couldn't find it.
Yeah.
It wasn't there. There were a few, well, I say it wasn't there. There were a few little strips of material, because, as you say, the micrometeorites, the radiation, the heat, the cold had destroyed the material.
I forgot about the heat and cold. You're right. So there's two more elements right there.
Yeah, it completely destroyed it.
Yeah.
So people now say, well, you can see the Apollo American flag left.
Oh, I know.
No, you can't.
Yeah, where are they getting this from? Because you can't, and nobody's been able to. I've had people online say that to me, and I say, post the link, and they say, well, go look for it yourself. Well, if you had it, to prove your point.
Just prove that the flag will survive 50 odd years in space. It won't.
No.
I mean, not made of nylon or if it was made of lead or something like that, maybe it would survive. But
some of it, maybe.
It might survive. But, I mean, some metals will survive. There are spacecraft that have been out there for 50 plus years. and we're told they still operate, some of them. But,
some of them.
You know, the idea that NASA cannot now take a photograph from 15 miles away through space and show detail of a craft they claim is on the lunar surface without putting a whacking great arrow saying lunar lander or lunar rover.
Yeah.
I mean, take those away from the picture. You don't know what you're looking at. Maybe it's a big rock which casts a shadow. So they've created this myth and they're trapped by it. I could, if I felt so inclined, and I don't, I could feel so inclined to believe that NASA have trapped themselves on the horns of a terribly unfortunate dilemma. They've created this story, which was probably legitimate to create it at the time. You've got to put Apollo into context.
Yep.
Apollo happened at the time of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was getting very unpleasant. There was no reason for the Vietnam War. Vietnam was not about to invade America, but America sent 500,000 troops into Vietnam to protect the South Vietnamese government from the invading guerrilla armies of North Vietnam. That was the alleged purpose. But because they were so badly equipped, badly outnumbered, they were defeated. Now, that was going on at the time of the elections in America, the election, because Lyndon Johnson had said he wasn't going to stand for a second term. So Nixon was campaigning. I forget who he was even campaigning against. It doesn't really matter, but he was elected. So all this was going on at the same time. And we know how riotous it gets in America when they have an election. So there had to be some good news, and Apollo was the good news. We're going to land on the moon, as directed by martyred President John Kennedy. We're going to land on the moon. So all this was going on. So this was being planned at the same time as the Vietnam War was being planned. The Vietnam War was a great deal more expensive than Apollo. You know, it's billions of dollars in terms of, and 58,000 Americans were killed, along with 3 million Vietnamese. Yeah. That is the price of incompetent government.
Yeah.
People die. And, you know, it's quite serious when you die. You don't get a second chance when you had a bullet in your head.
Yeah.
You're dead. You're underground. You're 6 foot under.
Yeah. And you know, contrast that with the plaque that was supposedly put on the moon. We came here in peace for all mankind. While that was going on, I mean, it's enough to, if you think about it long enough, it's enough to really rile you up, to say the least.
It does.
And you know, what about the poor, unfortunate civilian, soldier and civilian, or civilian who got a bullet in the head? Where's his history, her history? Who thinks about him? Who thinks about her? What about the children back then? Who thinks about any of them? We're too busy praising heroes, and we're not taking into consideration what the cost of producing those heroes was.
Yeah, exactly.
And that really, really, really annoys me. It's with me every day, every minute of every day, that we conveniently as a human race forget about the people who were behind the scenes, who had nothing at all to do with Apollo, but paid for it in some form with their lives.
Yeah, they would have paid for their lives. And yet we're continually being told that the heroes of Apollo were the astronauts. Yeah, they probably were. Yeah. Idiots who would fly in planes that hadn't been tested properly.
Yeah, that's so appropriate, idiots.
Your love's just like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line from